All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're wading into, well, it's not exactly a thrill ride, but definitely important, the Federal Election Commission, the FEC.
Yeah, not exactly a household name, but definitely plays a big role behind the scenes.
That's right. We actually got a really interesting excerpt from the Mandate for Leadership, and their take on the FEC really caught my eye. We're calling this one Navigating the Labyrinth of Campaign Finance because, well, it can be a bit of a maze.
You're not kidding. It's a complex system for sure.
So, for anyone who might not be familiar with the ins and outs of campaign finance, can you give us a quick rundown of what the FEC actually does? What's their main gig?
So basically, the FEC is the main governing body when it comes to federal elections in the U.S.
Okay, so we're talking presidential elections, congressional races, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. Anything to do with how money is raised and spent during those elections, the FEC is involved. They enforce campaign finance law, ensuring, or at least aiming to ensure, that everything is above board.
So they're like the referees of the political money game, making sure no one's cheating the system.
That's a good way to put it. They make sure campaigns are following the rules, reporting their finances transparently, and not doing anything shady with those campaign dollars.
Because, let's face it, where there's money and power, there's always the potential for, shall we say, creative accounting.
Unfortunately, you're right. That's why the FEC exists, to try to keep things clean and fair. They were actually created back in 1975.
75, wow. So they've seen a lot of elections.
Oh yeah, they've seen it all. And they get their authority from the Federal Election Campaign Act, usually called FECA for short.
Right, FECA, that's the law that lays out all the rules for campaign finance.
Exactly. And the FEC's job is to enforce those rules.
It sounds like a tough job, honestly, especially because campaign finance laws can be pretty complicated.
For sure. And it's not just about the complexity, it's the fact that they're dealing with some really fundamental rights here. Campaign finance is directly tied to free speech, political activity, all protected by the First Amendment.
That's a really important point. It's not just about bean counting. It's about balancing those First Amendment rights with the need for fairness and transparency in our elections.
Absolutely. And that's a constant balancing act for the FEC. They have to make sure campaigns can operate freely and exercise their First Amendment rights while also making sure those campaigns aren't exploiting the system or undermining the integrity of our elections.
Sounds like they've got their work cut out for them.
You can say that again. And to add another layer of complexity, the FEC itself is structured in a way that's designed to prevent any one party from having too much control.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little. How is the FEC structured? Who are the players?
So at the top, you've got 6 commissioners. And these aren't just any 6 people. They're appointed by the president.
Appointed by the president, and it's inherently a political process,
You
right?
got it. But here's the catch. No more than 3 commissioners can be from the same political party.
Ah, so it's a built-in system of checks and balances, like a mini Congress, but for campaign finance.
Exactly. And to further ensure that balance, the Senate has to confirm the president's nominees. So it's not just one branch of government calling the shots.
Okay, so we've got the president nominating, the Senate confirming, and this built-in bipartisan structure. It seems like a pretty good system, at least in theory. But how well does it actually work in practice?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Okay.
And that's what we're going to dig into as we move forward with this deep dive. We'll explore the arguments of reform, the challenges the FEC faces, and how this agency, often overlooked, plays a critical role in shaping the landscape of American politics.
Stay tuned. It's about to get interesting. All right, so we're back and ready to dive into the nitty-gritty of these reform proposals. Our source, the Mandate for Leadership, lays out a pretty conservative approach to reshaping the FEC. They've got some interesting ideas about where to start.
Yeah, they don't hold back. One of the first things they tackle is the president's role in nominating those commissioners we talked about.
Yeah.
It's this tricky balance, right?
Right, because on the one hand, you've got the president's prerogative to appoint people who align with their vision.
Exactly. But then you've got the whole purpose of the FEC, which is to be this neutral body.
So how do they propose walking that tightrope?
Well, they argue that a president should absolutely prioritize appointing commissioners who share their views on campaign finance, especially, and this is key, when a commissioner's term has actually expired, not just, hanging on in limbo.
Oh, I see. So it's about using those appointments strategically to try to influence the direction of the FEC.
Exactly. It's like playing chess, thinking several moves ahead. They also delve into the role of the Department of Justice. the DOJ.
Okay, so how does the DOJ factor into all of this?
Well, the authors argue that the DOJ should only prosecute very clear violations of FECA, like slam dunk cases, no room for interpretation.
Interesting. So they're talking about setting a really high bar for prosecution. What's the thinking there?
Well, they stress that the DOJ's interpretation of campaign finance law needs to be consistent with how the FEC itself interprets the law.
Which makes sense. You don't want two different parts of the government operating on totally different understandings of the rules.
Exactly. And they're concerned that right now there's too much room for inconsistency, which just creates confusion and uncertainty for everyone involved.
Especially for the campaigns themselves. I mean, imagine trying to navigate those waters, not knowing if the DOJ is going to come knocking because of some obscure interpretation of a rule.
Absolutely. It's like trying to hit a moving target. And the authors argue that this lack of clarity, this potential for differing interpretations, actually hurts the whole system.
Okay, so that's the DOJ. What about the FEC's own legal authority? Do they touch on that?
Oh, yeah, they definitely do. And this is where it gets even more interesting. So the FEC actually has independent litigation authority.
Wait, hold on. Most agencies don't have their own legal teams.
Not quite.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the Department of Justice represents them in court. But the FEC, they've got their own lawyers, and they can choose to pursue legal action independently.
Interesting. So they have a bit more autonomy in that sense.
They do. But our authors see this as a problem. They argue it lets a minority of commissioners bypass that 4-vote requirement we discussed earlier.
Ah, okay. I see where this is going. So it's a potential loophole in the system.
That's their argument. They cite instances where the FEC has declined to defend itself in lawsuits, essentially letting a few commissioners dictate the entire legal strategy for the whole agency.
Wow, that's pretty significant. So what do they propose doing about it?
They've got two main suggestions. First, they think the president should just step in and instruct the attorney general to defend the FEC in any lawsuit where the commission itself won't, basically taking away that option to not defend.
Makes sense. And the second suggestion?
Even more drastic. They say just get rid of the FEC's independent litigation authority altogether.
Wow. Give the reins back to the Department of Justice.
Exactly. It's a pretty bold stance. But it shows how seriously they take this issue. They see this independent litigation power as a real weakness, a way for a small group to exert undue influence.
So, big picture, what does all this legal wrangling mean for, the average person? How does it affect someone who's not a lawyer, not a politician, just trying to understand the rules of the game?
That's a great question. And the authors are very aware of that concern. They argue that the current system, with all its inconsistencies and legal gray areas, is just too confusing for the average person to navigate.
Which isn't exactly a recipe for a healthy democracy, is it?
Right. They believe everyone involved, from candidates to donors to everyday citizens, deserves clear, easy-to-understand guidelines. And they're not seeing that right now. They point out that several parts of FECA, even some of the FEC's own regulations, have been deemed unlawful or unconstitutional by courts.
Wait, really? So some of the rules are basically null and void?
Exactly. But they often stay on the books, which just adds to the confusions, like trying to read a map where half the landmarks no longer exist.
No kidding. Talk about information overload. So what's their solution?
Well, they call for some serious cleanup. They think the president should direct the FEC to provide clear, concise guidance on all of these legal gray areas. Basically, cut through the jargon and tell people what they need to know.
Seems reasonable enough.
Right. And they're not just putting it all on the FEC. They also suggest that if the FEC drags its feet, the Attorney General should step in and issue guidance directly.
So a two-pronged approach to increase clarity and transparency. I like it.
Me too. Makes a lot of sense. And speaking of clarity, they also have some thoughts on those long-serving commissioners we mentioned earlier. Remember how we talked about how they can basically stay in their positions indefinitely?
Yeah, I was wondering when we'd circle back to that. It's not exactly the most, shall we say, dynamic system.
Exactly. And the authors agree. They're not fans of this whole lifetime appointment by default situation.
So what's their alternative?
They propose a much more proactive approach. Prioritize new nominations as soon as a commissioner's term ends. Don't let those seats sit vacant for years.
Okay, so more urgency, less foot dragging.
Exactly. They even suggest putting time limits on how long commissioners can stay on after their terms expire.
Interesting. So no more commissioners serving for decades on end.
That's the idea. They're aiming for a system with more regular turnover, which in their view would prevent any one commissioner or even a small group from holding on to power for too long and potentially influencing the FEC's direction in a way that's not truly representative of the American people.
It's all about maintaining that balance, that neutrality, which is easier said than done when you've got these long-serving figures who might be reluctant to give up the reins.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a constant push and pull. And speaking of push and pull, we haven't even gotten to the author's thoughts on campaign contribution limits.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one. I'm guessing they're in favor of keeping them strict.
Well, that's where they might surprise you. They actually make a case for raising them significantly.
Raising contribution limits. Now, that's a twist I wasn't expecting. Most folks are usually advocating for stricter limits, not looser ones. So why do they think that's a good idea?
Well, they argue, and it's an interesting argument, that those limits, while well-intentioned, they don't actually do much to prevent corruption. In fact, they might even make things worse.
Okay, now you've got my attention. How could raising contribution limits possibly make things less corrupt?
Their point is that these limits, they create an uneven playing field. They actually end up favoring the wealthy, the special interest groups, those who can already find ways around the rules.
Because those folks, they'll always find a way, right?
Exactly. Meanwhile, everyday citizens, smaller campaigns, they're stuck playing by the rules, which puts them at a disadvantage. So the authors argue that raising the limits would actually level the playing field, encourage broader participation.
So it's about democratizing the process, making it easier for everyone to get involved, not just those with the deepest pockets.
Exactly. And they believe that focusing on transparency, making sure candidates are accountable for how they use their money, regardless of where it comes from, that's more effective than just putting a cap on donations.
Transparency over arbitrary limits. It's a different way of looking at it, that's for sure.
It is. And they have another interesting proposal, indexing reporting requirements to inflation.
Okay, let's unpack that one. We're talking about those detailed records campaigns have to keep of every dollar they raise and spend?
Exactly. And right now, those requirements, they haven't kept pace with inflation. So campaigns are stuck reporting even small transactions, which creates a ton of paperwork for them and for the FEC.
So it's like trying to track every single penny in a multi-million-dollar operation. Seems like a recipe for inefficiency.
That's exactly what they argue. They say this focus on tiny transactions takes resources away from investigating the big stuff, the stuff that can really swing an election.
So it's about working smarter, not harder, focusing on the forest, not just the trees.
Exactly. Index those reporting thresholds to inflation, they say, and the FEC can focus on the big picture, the big money moves that could actually signal corruption.
It makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. So after this deep dive into campaign finance, what's the author's main takeaway? What's their biggest concern?
It's interesting. Their biggest concern isn't actually about the FEC being too lax. It's about the opposite. Over-enforcement.
Over-enforcement. Now, that's not something you hear every day. What do they mean by that?
They argue that being too aggressive in regulating campaigns, it can actually stifle political speech, make people less likely to participate, especially newcomers, grassroots organizations, those without a lot of resources.
So it's like the rules themselves, even if they're meant to prevent problems, they can actually end up discouraging the very participation that makes a democracy vibrant.
Exactly. They want to see a more nuanced approach,
Yeah.
one that preserves the integrity of elections, for sure, but doesn't create so many roadblocks that it discourages people from getting involved in the first place.
It's a tough balance to strike, but that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. We've explored the FEC, tackled some pretty bold reform proposals, and really grappled with this fundamental question. How do we ensure fair and transparent elections without stifling the very heart of our democracy?
It's a question with no easy answers. But by engaging in these conversations, by exploring different perspectives, we can hopefully move towards a system that works better for everyone.
Absolutely, and that's what we encourage all of you listening to do. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions. Because at the end of the day, the future of our democracy depends on all of us. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.